with that initiative, what we're really trying to do is not to say we need to take computers out of everything. It's that the trust we place in these things should be commensurate with their trustworthiness. So, if you have trust in something that's untrustworthy, you can work on one or the other side of that, or both sides. But you can either depend on it less or make it more dependable. And so, what we want to do is make it more dependable, because, like you said, I mean, if you can get cardiac telemetry to a doctor before the patient gets there, then they can have waiting the right types of technologies, people, and processes to save that life.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of 401 Access Denied. I'm your host for the episode today. I'm Joe Carson, Chief Security Scientist and Advisory CISO at Thycotic Centrify. It's a pleasure to be here with you, and I've got an exciting episode for you. And it's one that we haven't really veered into in previous episodes, or actually to date. And I'm really excited about this topic because for me, it's a passion of mine. And I've got two awesome guests on the show today. Which we're kind of going to go and introduce them. So first of all, Beau, I'll pass over to you. Do you want to give us a little bit about yourself, what you do, and where you're from, and your background, and what passions do you have?
Yeah, thank you. Really excited to be here. I'm Beau Woods. I wear a variety of hats. Been in the InfoSec, cybersecurity, cyber policy world for 15 to 20 years now, professionally. Before that, I like to say I was a security amateur. I made a lot of mistakes on my own and other people's computers. Um, got into this line of work because I was just kind of drawn into it. Like a lot of us, we were powered by curiosity to just like get engaged, get involved, pull something apart, figure out how it works, put it back together. Maybe you got some extra pieces lying around or whatever. I've done a variety of things over my career, including a lot of consulting work. I still run a small consulting company. Done a lot with DEF CON. You can see the DEF CON flag in the background here, and a lot of the villages, Aerospace Village, Biohacking Village, Hack the Sea and ICS Village, as well as got involved a few years ago in a lot more in public policy. And as we were talking about before we kicked it off, worked for the Atlantic Council, which is a global public policy think tank, for a few years. Then got pulled in by the FDA to help develop new pathways to market for medical devices, which is some really, really interesting work. And now I'm, in addition to many of the other hats that I'm wearing, I'm advising CISA with some of the security of critical infrastructure in the US and internationally.
Awesome. And, we probably crossed paths at some point in the past, because when you mentioned a lot of those things, we talked about the Atlantic Council, and also in the maritime side, I spent a lot of time doing the autonomous shipping side and hacking into ships. So absolutely. So we probably at some point cross paths. And also another guest on the show, which is fantastic to have, as well as Paulino. Paulino, welcome to the show. It was a little bit about yourself and your passions and what you do.
Thanks for Joseph for the invitation. Well, I'm Paulino Calderon. I'm a Mexican. I've been in the InfoSec industry for about 15 years, I think. Right now, I'm working in WebSec, which is a consulting company. We do a bunch of AppSec and network security testing. And I guess the same as Beau, I started playing with routers back a long time ago. One of my business partners was really into router hacking. He started routerpoint.com back in the day.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess that was when I started kind of getting into IoT. At some point, I came across paths with Beau at some DerbyCon, I think, after party. And we ended up co-authoring this book, which led me to work with people. It's a small world, as you were mentioning. I ended up working with people from a different state in Mexico. They're called electronic cats. Since we were developing new tools for some radio IoT protocols, they had some, I guess, USB dongles that were brand new, and we were testing them and using them in our book. And we started communicating with them to debug certain things, and that ended up becoming another project that I started with them called the Cat Sniffer, which is a radio or a sniffer for radio IoT protocols. So I guess I'm in between also. It's in between AppSec, network security. I'm also a big fan of open source software.
Mhm.
So I've been contributing to Nmap since 2011. So I guess, see, some of you might have heard my name because of Nmap. A
Mhm.
lot of my contributions are there. I've been developing Nmap scripting engine scripts for a while now, and a bunch of different things. Like I'm also, I guess, I run a local OWASP chapter, an official
Mhm.
OWASP project as well, and between work, hobbies, everything, I also own a restaurant. So I made the jump in between actually owning a cafeteria, which I'm still deciding if it was a good idea or not, but I love it. So yeah.
Absolutely. I mean, that's one thing is we curiosity is what drives all of us. That's for sure. And we really do. It's this industry. I agree. One of the things I find difficult sometimes is separating work from my hobby. And ultimately, what I find is that actually my work, my hobby turned into my job, which is always a fun thing to do for sure. And one of the things that brought us together is the fantastic book that you put together that you co-authored, which is fantastic. And it's one of the kind of it's something that's been missing in the industry for a long time is really getting into the IoT risks and IoT hacking and hardware hacking and the threats that's out there. I've been following the likes of Joe Grant for many years. I think we all have into a lot of his early work in the early 2000s. And it's an area in the industry which is kind of really probably lacking a lot of the good, let's say, end-to-end understanding about how everything works because it is very diverse. There's so many components into it. Just kind of give me a little bit about kind of where did the idea come from the book? Who came up with the idea, and kind of a little bit about how much effort was put into putting it together. Because I've done a few books. Mine have been very thin, as you can see. So it takes months to do those. But putting a book together that you used it, I think it's amazing and it's definitely needed in the industry. Who
Yeah.
wants to start on that?
I
Bo, okay.
I think it was Fotis
Hmm.
Chances brought the idea to us. It was like, hey, we're doing a lot more in IoT security, and at the time he was working at the Mayo Clinic. So
Hmm.
initially we were going to focus on medical devices,
Ah, okay.
but I think very very smartly, No Starch Press, who's a great publisher, if you ever get a chance to write with them, they're really good. They were like, yeah, that's a little bit too niche. Why don't you broaden it out to more IoT? We're like, oh, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So it became an IoT book. But over the course of doing it, it took us probably 2 years to get it all written and published. Many different iterations, many versions. We had some ideas that we jettisoned. We had some things that, since we sat with the material for so long working on it, we had new things that we were able to pull in. And like we have a whole chapter on methodologies, so it's not just here's a very narrow thing, go hack on this stuff. It's like, what's the philosophy behind this?
Hmm.
We've also got a lot of words dedicated to thinking through some of the consequences of this, right? We
Hmm.
had guest writers come in like Dr. Marie Moe, who's very well known. She is both a security researcher and worked with Norwegian CERT, and she's also a pacemaker patient. And she talked about um, some of the consequences of hacking IoT devices, because ultimately, at the end of the day, we don't want just to empower people and equip people to be able to do the technical bits and bytes. With the Internet of Things, broadly, including medical devices, power plants, maritime equipment, aerospace, everything is very very different. And if you don't have a great understanding of what happens after the hack,
Hmm.
it could set up some really dangerous situations. We wanted to avoid that, right? We wanted to
Hmm.
make sure that we're uh, empowering people to understand all of the context and the consequences of what they're going to do, so that they can be way better at it and do things that are more meaningful, more
Hmm.
important, rather than just finding the next little bug. Find a bug in something that's really critical, and then you can change the world with that.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and especially with technology that dies really fast,
Hmm.
we wanted to put the holistic approach, teaching people how would you approach this thing, how could you create new tools that are not out there yet. because that's what the majority of the time you will be doing, right? You will be breaching the gap and coming up with new things and new techniques. And also
Mhm.
at the beginning of the book, we had very good content that couldn't get published because of the nature of it. So we
Mhm.
ended up having to look for more generic and, I guess,
Okay.
replicable examples, which ended up becoming a good thing because we focus on getting things that are easy to replicate and that are cheap and
Mhm.
accessible for everyone.
Yeah, and
Absolutely.
in fact, we because we recognize that devices change so quickly. Paulino, do you want to talk a little bit about the software stack that you guys put together,
Which one? The
like the IoT Goat and some of the other things that we did in order to have evergreen examples that people could work
Mhm.
on?
Yeah, exactly. One of the projects that came out of the book while we were writing it
Mhm.
was OWASP IoT Goat, which
Mhm.
I'm sure most of you are familiar with the older version or the more, I guess, known version, Web Goat.
Mhm.
So it was the same idea. It was vulnerable in purpose IoT PM. So it was
Mhm.
based on Open WRT. It became an official OWASP project. We got funding for a student to work on it full time during Google Summer of Code, I think last year, right before the pandemic started. And
Mhm.
yeah, it kind of like became an OWASP official project from since then.
Absolutely. I'm actually hoping that at some point in time, because I know that OWASP does has their IoT top 10. I think it goes back to 2018 or so. Hopefully, it'll be updated soon. So like, definitely, it's an area that I know they updated the web application one in the last couple of months. So hopefully, the IoT one will also get that same attention. I'd like to also get into, because for me, I think over the years I've been dabbling into the hardware hacking and IoT side of things. I've been involved in projects. I've been involved in things like where we talked about autonomous shipping. I remember in the early days of the issues was not technical issues; it was legal issues. In autonomous shipping, one of the challenges was in international waters they couldn't actually have vessels that didn't have anybody on the vessel. There was actually international maritime law meant that you actually had to have a person on the boat. So what they ended up doing was having those types of projects in local waters, the likes of Finland, in let's say barges and so forth, and icebreakers and other things. So they actually focused on the projects. So one thing I like to, it's also a very kind of focused area where it can be expensive to get into. Because when you get into hardware hacking, the equipment, if you think about some of the things, even digital multimeters and oscilloscopes, and I think of a array of things like bus pirates and blasters and great fight ones and stuff. I mean, what would you recommend people start to get into it? I mean, even you can get into not just about the hardware debugging side of things and extracting firmware, but you also get into there's the software side. There's also the wireless side of things, the radio frequencies and RFIDs. It gets into whole extensive different things. Where would you recommend people get started? What's the essentials they should have in their labs?
Yeah, I think one of the things that is kind of cool, but also kind of
Mm.
daunting about IoT is you there's so much stuff that can be IoT, right?
Yep.
You've got on a lot of these devices, you've got a web stack. So if you're
Hmm.
familiar with web application security or mobile application security, a lot of them have apps.
Hmm.
So that can be kind of the gateway that gets you into this. Um, and in fact, when we were doing for the biohacking village, Fotis and I met Fotis through the biohacking village.
Okay.
I started the device lab there, and we started up a capture the flag, and I think it might be the first, but now it's not the only, but the first capture the flag for medical devices. And we wanted to have a steady ramp because IoT is intimidating for a lot of people. But what we wanted to show them is that if you have skills here, you can translate them here. If you don't have skills over here, then maybe you team up with somebody in the capture the flag and you learn those skills and you teach them, the web skills and you learn the RFID skills or what have you. And so I think for a lot of people, IoT can be really accessible. Some corner
Mhm.
of IoT that you can start working on and learn some of the other things. But I know Paulino's got a really extensive lab and does a ton of stuff. He's way smarter on some of the pieces that I'm not, which is great. Paulino, why don't you talk about your lab a little bit? I've seen some
I,
pictures
I
of it,
think
but
I was going to say the book kind of got brought together like that. Like everyone brought their own expertise in their own area,
Mm-hmm.
and that's how it kind of came one piece. But same as me, I suppose that I started with the basic multimeter, oscilloscope,
Mm-hmm.
some board to communicate with the traditional protocols, and then as I mentioned before, recently I started like going more into radio IoT hacking.
Mm-hmm.
So we had this new board, and we've been working on this board for a while. I kind of like this project a lot because it's an open source hardware, so all
Mm-hmm.
the schematics are posted, and it's also the software as well. But I don't know. I will always recommend to get one of those. It's a cat sniffer.
McKesson.
Everything
Okay.
most yeah, I guess the most common IoT protocols are supported there now.
Mm-hmm.
If you're planning with to play with radio IoT hacking, you should definitely get one. And we're planning to do something as the Bus Pirate does. You know how the
Okay.
Bus Pirate, you have macros pre-programmed to attack certain protocols,
Mm-hmm.
or known attacks to replicate. We're
Yes.
trying to do the same on the cat saver for radio IoT.
Oh,
So
interesting. Okay.
yeah, my answer will be just depending on what area you're planning to get to,
Mm-hmm.
just familiarize yourself with what technologies are there and take it from there.
Yeah, because that's actually I think where I started a lot is in the radio side. I got into quite a few years ago into SDR. Listening to radio signals. Amateur broad. Was it radio bands? Get into the things of listening to the ISS space station. And listening to local pilots, and then getting the ACARs and ADIS and stuff. Coming back in. So that's really where I started, and then kind of moved from there into other areas. So, for me, it's absolutely when you're talking about, being able to, with the radio side of things, it's always an interesting, because for me, it was in maritime signals. It was all about, the navigation of ships and vessels and communications and so forth. So that was always interesting. And also a very cheap way to get in as well, because a lot of those SDRs now were very affordable, where previously, could be very expensive. So definitely an area for people. I mean, when you're going through the book, and there's a lot of devices that you recommend in the book. What would be the first area in the book that you recommend people to go through? Let's say as one of the test scenarios. I know you mentioned a lot about there's a couple of scenarios with the blue pill or the black pill that's been used into being able to read and write firmware. What areas would you recommend people getting started, or just getting some older vulnerable hardware and pulling it apart? Such as some older webcams or routers. What would you recommend people getting started when they're going through the book in regards to doing some of the tests?
I would recommend that they try to get the hardware that we put there,
Mm-hmm.
because most of it is open source and they can get it for a fairly low price, and it's
Mm-hmm.
accessible for anywhere in the world. But what I would recommend is like kind of like start playing around what you have around, the technologies or the
Mm-hmm.
things or appliances that you have at work and at home, and that way you don't need to end up like me with boxes of full of devices that you never use, and you don't have space to anywhere to put them.
Absolutely. I think
yeah.
we all have a lot of old mobile phones around our homes that definitely are just sitting gathering dust. So you can definitely pull those apart and start checking and reading the firmware from them as well. Absolutely, that's a good starting point. Is use the things that's around you that might be broken. Be curious, pulling apart, open it up. Because definitely one of the things I went through is the FCC website, where you can actually go and start looking at a lot of the schematics, and looking at what things, the radio frequencies that are published there, because they do have to post the radio frequencies, whether it being things like doorbells, or whether it being remote controls, or Wi-Fi signals and so forth. So definitely looking at a lot of those areas. So definitely. But what do you think around that side of things? Where would you recommend people get started as well?
Yeah, I mean, start with whatever you're excited about. Like for
Mm-hmm.
me, anyways, like if I'm excited about something, I'm naturally going to put more time into it. I'm going to learn it better. And then like you said, anything you've got just laying around can also be a
Mm-hmm.
good starting point. But also, I kind of want to point out that different people might have different starting points, and
Mm-hmm.
it can be okay, right? I've had a number of people who like they're not technical at all, and they're like, "Oh, I bought the book and it was great." I'm like, "You like no disrespect, but you don't have a technical background, technical knowledge. Like, yeah, but like some of the examples up front and some of the other things in there, I just perused through it, and some of it was really accessible to me, and some of it was really super dense, but I enjoyed reading it anyways.
Mm-hmm.
And we did try to create pathways to entry for different types of people. So the first couple of chapters are really non-technical.
Yeah, very strategy
They're
focused and risk
yeah,
focused. Yeah.
yeah, that's right. And the last chapter too is like how to okay, so you've got these things in your
Mm-hmm.
enterprise. How do you defend against potential attacks? And so we made it that way intentionally so that it would have a broader
Mm-hmm.
accessibility, so that people could get it, be less intimidated, and again have that entry point where they could start learning. Like, oh, I really want to know how you do pivoting from one device you get access to into the rest of the network. And so like there's some breadcrumbs there that
Mm-hmm.
can lead people to jump into whatever section they're most curious about, and then keep the rest of the book on the shelf as just a reference.
Absolutely. I mean, that's. I showed you my version, which has got full of yellow post-it notes,
Yeah.
which is something that I've commonly done. I think one of the first things I end up getting more into the kind of the hardware diagnosis was one. As I mentioned, I got into the radio side of things. I get into RFIDs, and I had a couple of Proxmarks and chameleons and so forth. And one of the things I ended up doing was years ago when I did accidentally, I plugged it into the wrong virtual machine, and I did a flash of my Proxmark, and like many people out there, we bricked it. And you're just like, what do I do? And then you go and you get yourself a bus pirate or something similar, and you start trying to flash the firmware through JTAG. And that was probably one of the first ones I really started getting into, was actually by myself breaking something and then going and trying to find as much information as possible. And that was for, there was no, for me at the time, there's no one guide. There was no, somebody had something about, here's how you flash the firmware on it. Somebody had something about, well, if you run into this error when you're flashing it, this is the chip on the pin that you need to short circuit in order to actually get it to reset. It was things all over the place in order to try and go through it. And that was for me, as breaking my own things was one of the reasons why, of course, you don't want to go out and buy new ones or replacements. So the best thing is to repair it. And I think that's really a lot of things, is that curiosity about things and repairing them. It was kind of, so for me, that was one of the areas I started was breaking a Proxmark and kind of trying to get it to work with the low cost as possible. I'm just curious into, is that one of the things that at the time when I was going through that I realized what I wasn't really good at was soldering skills. I've set off too many fire alarms and smoke alarms over the past couple of years, which probably more than what I'd like to mention. But is that something, what areas, you mentioned about, going to other people who have knowledge in those areas. Do you recommend kind of people trying to explore skills in soldering and power? I don't know how many times you've short circuited and got electric shocks over times as well. So safety is always first. So any thoughts around people who's looking to enhance those skills? How, because it is very physical focused. It's very hands on rather than what we would have done kind of more the soft side of things. Any thoughts around people who's looking to get into the soldering side of things and repairing and electricity?
Yeah, I'd say it's a skill that I encourage people to get familiar with, even if you're
Mm.
not going to use it a ton, because when you really need to use it and you don't have it, then you're going to get over ambitious and you're going to end up breaking something, or in some cases, breaking it more than it already is broken.
Yes.
Um, One of my first hardware hacking was way back in the day with the original Xbox that came out,
Okay.
and folks like Bunny Wang figured out that you could mod the Xbox and do other things with it, like turn it into a media server, which was pretty cool, right?
Yep.
And then send stuff out to your TV. And to do that, you had to get a mod chip for it. And I remember I bought a mod. I had the Xbox, which was, I don't even remember how much money that was. It was more than I wanted to spend, but it was a fun project. And then I had to get the mod chip special, ordered from someplace else. And then it just came with like all of these pins, and I was like, oh no, what do I do now? And so fortunately, I had a friend of mine who was an electrical engineer and he had some of the equipment around, and taught me how to do some basic
Hmm.
soldering. And after I screwed up two or three of the pins, he was like, "Let me just help you with the rest of that." And so he ended up doing all the soldering to get the chip installed. Um, but it's one of those skills that, again, I think it's really handy to have,
Hmm.
and to develop so that you'll have it later when you need it. But I'm still not very good. If I sit down at like Hardware Hacking Village or someplace like
Hmm.
that at a hacker conference, uh, it's one of the things that's still daunting and intimidating to me. But there's some
And
cool kits out there
patience.
too that you can get.
Patience.
Yeah.
That's
Oh
one.
yeah.
That's one
Ton
thing.
of
Is
patience.
you're doing ball pin. I was watching. I think it was Jules was doing some ball pin stuff a few weeks ago, and just watching as he's
Mm.
posting his images, I'm just like, some people have really lots of patience to really focus on that area. And so, Paulino, I'd just like
Yeah.
to get some of your thoughts as well in that area. You like to be, was it agreeing on the electricity side of things? I think I've been sitting in the dark. I always have a flashlight nearby nowadays because a lot of cases I blow the fuses. So just thoughts around
Yeah,
what you're.
for me, it was a new thing as well. I have a bad eyesight, and also my hands are quite big, so it's like that part by itself it's hard. So I got to practice a little bit when I started working with electronic cats. Um, and also, I think back in the day, I remember one of my friends took one of Joe Grant's course, and that's exactly what I remember the first times I started, breaking routers that aren't
Mhm.
mine, and just playing exactly more hands-on approach into that.
Absolutely. I was registered for Joe Gann's course, and it was the first one that was cancelled when the pandemic started, unfortunately. So that was a sad thing. Hopefully, at some point in time, when things get back to normal, that I'll be able to get into Joe's course, because it is very interesting. Just watching
I
it.
always
'Cause
hear from people that it's fantastic. So
yeah, but actually, one thing is, what, because when you get into, Bo, you mentioned around DEF CON, and DEF CON is definitely when I go around the villages. I hang out sometimes at the IoT. There's also, the Packet village. Um, there's of course what was the biohacking villages now, and the medical devices, and the voting village. Now it's really got into where it's almost everywhere. When you go to DEF CON, pretty much a lot of the villages are really focused around the hardware side of things. What other events throughout the year? I think there's a couple of hardware. There's hardware.io events. So I think that's another major event that focused around. And I did see one of my favorite events last year was KernelCon, which I so much. It was, I think for me, it was one of the most enjoyable events just to sit back as a. Normally, I get a lot when I'm going to events and speaking, but that was one event where I just sit back and I'm just going to watch and learn. And I was watching. It was Joe Grand running around looking for basically a blowtorch or a heater or something. It was really entertaining. What other events do you recommend people? Because this is it. As you mentioned, Bo, you mentioned about that, looking for someone who can help you. This is a very much a you need people to help you. There's a lot of, this isn't something that I recommend that you go and only do by yourself. You do need people who have specific expertise and skills to help guide you to make sure, one is safety and you don't electrocute yourself, because there is volts flowing through a lot of the devices. What other events do you recommend people go to try and network and connect with people to learn more?
Yeah, you mentioned one of them, Hardware IO.
Mhm.
The folks that run that are great, and they've expanded it. I remember the first Hardware IO that they had in the Netherlands.
Mhm.
I went there and brought some stuff, some car hacking stuff, and some or some people who did car hacking, and got them introduced. And it was really cool to see that community start to build and grow. And now they've got events all over the world. I think they've got. I think they just did one in Berlin. They do some in the U.S. Obviously, the Netherlands, they've still got that. But that's a
Mhm.
great place to go get training on hardware hacking, and it's exclusively dedicated to hardware stuff.
Absolutely.
So even if you just go and hang out, you'll learn a ton. I learned a ton. Um, Obviously, to some of the DEF CON trainings
Mhm.
and other things. Some of the villages you mentioned are really cool. But also like maker hacker spaces in your own community if you've got one around,
Mhm.
where you might be able to just drop in on a Wednesday or whatever when they're doing an open session, and go learn there, or some other other similar types of things. There's a big community around hardware hacking and growing too, depending on where
Absolutely.
you live in the world.
Yeah, I
Absolutely.
find online you can also find help online through just
Mhm.
ask people that you know that are working on something similar than yourself. Most of the
Okay.
time, they'll be willing to help you.
Hmm.
That's true. Yeah, and
Absolutely.
we've thought about starting up like a Discord channel or something to work with people. I don't know if other people would be interested, but maybe one of the things we can do with this is okay. We've got the first joiner.
Absolutely.
Um, but yeah, I mean, there's got to be some other communities to tap into. Paulino, we should probably get more involved and check it out and see if there's already a Discord that we could join, or how we want to do that.
Yeah, absolutely. And probably, the one probably hardware that is the closest they get to is with Christian Iceman. He runs the RFID channel, which is mainly focused on
Mhm.
radio. Was it? But it's focused on of course the Proxmark side of things, and they focus on the radio and RFID signals. But absolutely having a much more broad scope hardware one that of course you can separate into different channels. That would be a great idea because I haven't seen one myself. I've seen ones that kind of have focused in certain areas, but not, as you said, when you talked about when you were doing the book, that with no starch, it's saying you need something a bit more broader. And absolutely, for me, a niche area that you focus into specific industries would exclude a lot of people's interest. But when you get into a much broader perspective, it gets a lot of people's interest in there. So having a community and Discord is a great way. And I thought the way KernelCon did their event last year virtually, they did a
Mhm.
combination of, I think it was Twitch and Discord, was a great way, and it
Yeah.
was a really exciting event. So I definitely one that I thought was really well executed.
Yeah, and I guess to that point, we do have a channel for the book in the IoT Village Discord.
Mhm.
So if people want to check that out, you can go there. We can get you the link to that.
Yeah, absolutely.
But
We'll,
like,
we'll make sure that all the links that you send and share, we'll get them into the show notes as well, so the audience will not
yeah,
have to go searching for them.
and it makes me wonder now if I don't know if Hardware Hacking Village has a Discord, but maybe maybe people could go check that out if they do.
Absolutely. So for organizing, one of the things that of course, a lot of the in the past, the hardware side was mainly either focused at consumer side, and also most consumers were adopting a lot of IT, and then there was also dedicated businesses. I remember one of the things I worked on. It was actually one of the earliest things I worked on was in the medical side of things, where
Hmm.
I was responsible for the ambulance service. And one of the first things I did was we had to buy a bunch of new ambulances. And at the time, there was a major. We were under SLA, which was that if the ambulances didn't get to the emergency or to the victim and back to the emergency room within a certain amount of time, we actually had legal requirements in order to make sure that we were able to get to any victims in 21 minutes. So one of the things at the time, and this is back in I think it was 1999, 2000, we end up connecting the defibrillators and EPGs within the ambulances. We took an old
Hmm.
Nokia 3110 with a data cable, and we were sending all of those through fax into the emergency room. And so
Wow.
the doctors basically in the emergency room would have this fax printout of all the health readings from the patients as they were en route
Yep.
to the emergency room. And for me, when I go back and think of some of those early things, those were some of the things that we were in a kind of trying to use technology to put all these pieces together to save lives. And it becomes very
Yeah.
critical. A lot of these things, and over the times when people ask me in the security industry about what's my biggest fear, and I see that our lives are becoming more dependent on a lot of these technologies. You mentioned about pacemakers that are connected, maybe communicating through people's mobile phones through the Bluetooth that's near field proximity and so forth. What risks do we face with a lot of as IoT is becoming? My interpretation is always IoT. I think sometimes we use IoT as this very broad term, and I remember one of my mentors saying, it's basically network connected devices. We talk about IoT, it's literally the internet. It's like a device is
Hmm.
connected.
I
Um,
think Bo had a great definition for IoT. What was that, Bo?
Yeah, I don't even remember what it was, but it was like something kinetic can happen from a computer connected thing, which is,
Yeah,
again, it's still a very broad definition, but it
a
gets it
kinetic
into
impact.
that. Yeah.
Most
But yeah, I
absolutely.
mean, you one of the things I didn't really touch on in my intro is I've been pretty heavily involved in something called I Am the Cavalry over the past
Hmm.
several years,
Yep.
which the problem statement for I Am the Cavalry is our dependence on connected technology has grown faster than our ability to secure it in areas impacting human life, public safety. And uh, with that initiative, what we're really trying to do is not to say we need to take computers out of everything.
Hmm.
It's that the trust we place in these things should be commensurate with their trustworthiness.
Hmm.
So, if you have trust in something that's untrustworthy, you can work on one or the other side of that, or both sides. But you can either depend on it less or make it more dependable.
Hmm.
And so, what we want to do is make it more dependable, because, like you said, I mean, if you can get um, cardiac telemetry to a doctor before the patient gets there, then they can have waiting the right types of technologies,
That's exactly that. Yep.
people, and processes to save that life.
That was
Um,
exactly
and
that was
so,
the main goal, was having
yeah,
readiness in the emergency room. So when
yeah,
people arrived, you had the right people that are waiting.
that's right. And you'll be happy to know, or maybe happy, maybe
Mm.
dismayed, but now having cellular connectivity on defibrillators in an ambulance is standard practice
Yep.
for that reason, right? And so, like, we can use this technology to greatly improve lives, to save
Hmm.
lives, and to make things better if we do it right. But one of the things that I really fear is not the insecurity of the technology, it's the lack of trust, the distrust.
Hmm.
So when a hedge fund started short selling a medical device maker,
Hmm.
and they brought their trained hackers on TV to say, "Look how bad this is. Um, everybody could die." You had a lot of like little old ladies and little old grandpas going into the doctor saying, "Cut this thing out of me. I don't trust it."
Hmm.
Right? You had I talked to some nurses from the Veterans Affairs Hospital, and they said that they had patients, military patients who would come in and they would say, "I'm not going to get a pacemaker, even though I know it's going to save my life, because I'm afraid that somebody might hack it and kill me." Um, and so, as part of the reason why we wrote the book the way we did, to talk to those consequences so that people are more conscious of them and don't make similar mistakes that can lead to people turning away from the best capabilities that we have to bring to bear on any particular problem. And I think that there's I've also done a lot of work in other areas. So if you're sounds like you're really into medical hacking, one of the things I do is I'm on the board of an organization called the CyberMed Summit, and we did the first ever clinical simulations for hacked medical devices. So just like pilots do flight simulators, so at the first time they're like landing with a 30-knot crosswind into fog. They've done it in a simulator and they know how to do it. They know how it feels. Doctors do the same thing. And so we had some brilliant physicians who are also DEF CON speakers and hackers themselves, who created these scenarios and ran a bunch of doctors through them, in order to train on that and in order to
Hmm.
get understanding of what would actually happen. And it turns out that, in healthcare, they've got a lot of redundancies, a lot of backups
Yep.
for very good reasons.
Yep.
So in running through some of those scenarios, the doctors, through individual heroics, were able to bring the patients back to life after a hacking event.
Hmm.
Um, but but there was a big gap there, which is that the doctors themselves never questioned the medical devices. They just thought that it would either be working perfectly or not working at all.
Hmm.
And so there are some things that we can take from this to improve the way that things like medical devices work, to improve the way that things like autonomous vehicles work,
Hmm.
maritime systems, aerospace, planes,
Industrial.
trains, yeah,
Yeah.
Industrial
industrial,
controls. Yeah,
yeah.
that's.
Um, and so I'm in this field. One of the reasons why I'm in this field is, well, it's cool, it's fun, it's exciting,
Mhm.
it's challenging, but also we can really do something better if we're consciously thinking, how do we improve it? Not just how do we
Mhm.
break it? How can we build something that is better, that impacts human lives in a positive way, rather than just the technical bits and bytes of it?
Absolutely. It's well said. I mean, that's for me, I think we're all looking to make the world a safer place. And one of the things I remember, I attended, it was one of the last not the last year's digital summit, which was more about government, geopolitical side of things.
Mhm.
The previous year was on artificial intelligence, for me, which is basically just automation. It's doing things in an automated way. But then, we made me realize when we're talking about it, it was about we must do it with responsibility and accountability. It's about doing things for the right reasons, not just because you can, but because you're going to make a difference. That's what I mentioned the kind of the story about the ambulances and the defibrillators and the emergency room, and that was all about basically saving lives. My SLA at the time is if my system wasn't running for 21 minutes, people died. That was that was my metrics. That's what I was basically measuring each year and every week. I had to make sure the systems were running. And as you
That's one of
mentioned,
the worst SLAs
oh,
I've
it's the
seen.
worst
I've heard.
SLAs you can have. It was, I
Yeah.
remember, it was, and the worst scenario was, Paulino, one of the worst things was, then that was, I was doing a Y2K. I was going around with the floppy disks, trying to protect against Y2K at the time. And one of the things that we were doing at the time was we were switching over our power. Our power was directly connected to the energy, the phases, and we were switching to a UPS for redundancy, just in case Y2K took out the electricity. And during that switch over the redundancy, I remember we had switched on the mainframes at the time, which was old IBM Alpha servers, and we switched them off. And we brought them back online. We're standing looking at this dumb terminal, old McDonnell Douglas dumb terminal screen, and with a little green flashing light. And I was freaking out because we passed the point of no return. The clock had already passed the point where we can actually revert, and we are going, is the system up and running or not? We had no idea, and we ended up having to get, because we were sitting in front of this server mainframe and no visibility of what was happening. So we had to get somebody from a remote ambulance service to connect back in through a dial-up line in order to see if actually anything was running on the server, because it was basically the emergency call line, and that's how people find where people's addresses were. So if you wanted an ambulance to go to an address, that was how they found it in the system. And ultimately ended up being a serial cable was broken. And I've never, ever since, I always have an extra serial cable in my bag, unfortunately, after that event. But that was my worry, is always about, and that's where we always should approach things when we talk about IoT. And, as you're mentioning, Beau, we approach it with health and safety as a priority. And I think that's where we historically have probably not in our industry have been really focusing on the right metrics. We were always focusing about vulnerabilities and patches but we should really be focused around, the risks of the devices. What's the real true impact, and what's the likeliness of that possibility happening? That's really liked at the beginning of the book. It really brought that as the first thing was about what is the risks, what impact do these devices potentially have, how do you do threat modeling, how do all these things connect together, what's the dependencies in each of these areas. And I thought the book did a really fantastic coverage in that, and some of the methodologies at the beginning really kind of highlighted the importance that organizations that we should approach this. And it's not, and also sometimes as well, it should not be just a IT problem or a security team problem. This is a business approach. And that's sometimes, when things go wrong, they point to the IT team, you need to fix it, or security team, this is vulnerable, you need to patch it. But don't realize that it's a business response. It's entire end to end, and we all need to work together.
Yeah, well said.
So other things, what do we need to do? You mentioned about I am the Calvary to really highlight these. How do we move forward? This is one of the things that I'm always worried that we're a little bit behind. We're definitely playing catch up in this field and area. We're coming up with a lot of great standards. I mean, in the EU, they're coming out with. I don't get labels and devices will be changing things very drastically. We did see the UK introducing a new law that said about having no default credentials on the system. So, which is another great step forward. What things do we need to be doing in order to, have, more trustworthy devices?
Yeah, I think you mentioned the UK Code of Practice for IoT
Mhm.
security. I think that's a great start. It's within the last few years, it's become a EU standard.
Mhm.
So the European standards group called ETSI, I always forget what it
Correct.
stands for, has now issued a couple of standards based on that, that are really well thought out. And that, for manufacturers, you can start building towards that. For hackers, you can start looking at those things and looking for those in devices and then framing it against that to have a more powerful way to kind of talk through that with the manufacturer or with policymakers.
Mhm.
Singapore, Australia, I think a couple of other countries have started adopting that as well. Um, uh, I know that I think it was in Norway
Mhm.
and in the UK and in Germany, where the like consumer product safety groups have raised awareness about security issues with IoT devices.
Mhm.
And those countries have actually banned those specific devices. So I remember there was one where it was a Kayla doll. And if you talk to Ken Monroe at Pen
Ken
Test
Monroe,
Partners, he's
yeah,
always got
yeah,
one of these
yeah.
that he brings out. But like you could hack the back end of it and pull down all of the data. Um,
Yes, all the
and I
voice
think that
recordings. Yeah.
right. So when one of the things for researchers, especially, is if you know about these types of issues,
Mhm.
don't just, tell the company, they say go away and then drop it on Twitter. But there's other avenues, right? In the
Mhm.
US, you can contact US CERT, ICS CERT, CERT CC. You can talk to other organizations who can help with that disclosure. In different countries, they have different groups that you can go talk
Mhm.
to. But if overall our goal is to save and improve lives with these
Mhm.
things, then we should be careful and take all due care to avoid accidentally harming it. Because at the end of the day, it's not about you, it's not about the company,
Mhm.
not about the tech, it's about the impact to people.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
and I
Look.
do see some challenges there. For example,
Mhm.
you've been talking a lot about policies in different countries, but
Mhm.
for Latin America, we're not really, pushing anything new in regards to that. And I see a bunch of security problems at least. Some of them have already been solved in different technologies. So
Mhm.
part of the problem, I guess, is how we are reusing the existing knowledge,
Mhm.
and the challenge of what companies have. Like if there are smaller companies, how can they afford, a full-on assessment of an external security? Maybe they don't have that knowledge.
Mhm.
So I think the risk is like, or part of the risks might come from different countries.
Mhm.
So whoever is producing those devices need to, start taking security more seriously. And as you mentioned, you see other, for example, Mexico is so close to the US,
Mhm.
and still we don't have anything in regards to that.
Yeah.
We're about to come up with the first cybersecurity laws, and we're ages behind or years
Mhm.
behind, even though we're so close. And at
Mhm.
the end of the day, we consume almost the same technology. Most of the same vendors are here.
Absolutely. Paulino, you bring up a very important point, which is supply chain. Is that when you get into a lot of this, is that a lot of the hardware and components of IoT devices is sourced through the supply chains, sometimes through the lowest component and bidder. And we
Hmm.
had a discussion. We had CJ and Katie on a while back in one of the episodes, and we were covering responsible disclosure programs. In IoT, that's a difficult thing because sometimes it means replacing the hardware. Is there a responsible disclosure for vulnerable hardware? And what's is that something that we need to be kind of also treating with a little bit more caution because replacing, one thing is updating the firmware, and a lot of these things that even the manufacturers, these hardware probably has even a 2-year warranty, and then they stop delivering updates. Unlike software, where you might have a longer stretch. What's your thoughts around responsible disclosure for IoT, and also the vendor's responsibility for keeping it secure over the longer term?
Yeah, it can get really really tricky when you think about coordinated
Mhm.
disclosure on IoT devices. And I know that there are some security researchers who have looked at they found a bug,
Mm-hmm.
they looked at the ecosystem of all the things it affected, and they said, sometimes security through obscurity is all you've got. And
Mm-hmm.
when that's the case, maybe you can't disclose. Now, as we all know, repeat discoveries happen, and some of those were discovered again and disclosed in a very, I'll say, limited coordinated fashion. So you talk to the single vendor who makes it, but not all of their customers. And
Mm-hmm.
so, like, at that point, you're just kind of in a race with the adversaries, which is not a place that anybody wants to be in. And it gets really, really difficult because, if you do have to replace the device, like this is common in healthcare, I'm sure it's common in maritime, it's common in a lot of places. Like, this medical device is still saving people's lives.
Mm-hmm.
If we have to replace all of them that are in the hospital, it might cost $8 million. How many treatments will that get for people who can't otherwise afford it? How many doctors will that afford? How many nurses will that afford?
Mm-hmm.
How many other things could we buy with that? And so you're in this situation where there's no easy answers. There's only really, really hard trade-offs.
Yeah.
And part of the equation is not knowable, right? Someone may hack it and cause something bad to
Mm-hmm.
happen. On the other hand, if you take those devices out of circulation, you absolutely know that patient safety and patient care will go
Mm-hmm.
down, right? So, like, in a lot of cases, on the operator side, it's an easy discussion. It's an easy
Mm-hmm.
choice for them. You take a guaranteed harm against a potential harm, and they're going to favor the avoid the guaranteed harm every time. For security researchers, though, it's really tough. And I've talked to a number of people who just wrestle with this. They know things that could probably kill folks, and they don't know whether to tell and who to tell about it. So we've got to do a lot better job um, shortening the time cycle between when the vulnerability is created by the developer and when
Mm-hmm.
it is ultimately fixed across the entire ecosystem.
Yeah.
Not just the products, but when the patches and updates are applied. Second, building more defensible architectures so that we can withstand the occasional time when
Mm-hmm.
you can't update. Third, having a little bit uh, better, more responsive ecosystem among security researchers and companies
Mm-hmm.
to be able to understand how, when, where to apply some of these different approaches to coordinated vulnerability disclosure. And in 50 years we'll have it all worked out, but we're going through a bumpy period, and it'll get worse before it gets better, I think, without some concerted effort. So, if you're a researcher, think about those types of things whenever you find a
Yeah.
vulnerability and something that could be in the supply chain for something that can't be replaced.
Yeah. Think about the impact. Paulino, any thoughts around vulnerability disclosure yourself? Any?
I've gotten mixed responses from the
Mm-hmm.
vendors.
Mm-hmm.
I disclosed a few of them to, and I guess I've gotten better responses from, I guess, more reputable vendors.
Mm-hmm.
For example, I'm thinking one case that we actually didn't get a response back, and it's one of the examples in the book. The smart water bottle that we mentioned in the
Mm-hmm.
book, it was the top seller back 2 or 3 years ago. And when we disclosed the vulnerability to them, we try at least like 5 or 6, 7 times all the
Mm-hmm.
details there in the email. We didn't get a
Yeah.
response back. And and part of the reason we chose that water bottle is because we knew it was harmless to disclose, right? Like,
Absolutely.
you could just spoof that they're drinking too much water. No one cares, right? But at the end of the day, that ended up becoming a more critical thing when we discovered that your location was being disclosed without your consent every
Mm-hmm.
10 minutes by itself. So it is a tricky situation, as you mentioned. I find that you will get mixed responses. Most of the time, you'll have to hold on the information and just keep the secret, I suppose. Or it's not like you
Yeah.
can patch it yourself, right?
Yeah.
So
Right.
as Bob mentioned, you are in a tough spot, and you need to think about the risks and
Yeah.
your consequences of
Especially for
disclosure.
software vulnerability, what we do is we wait for the patches available, and that's typically within usually that 90 days or 180 days, depending on kind of the criticality there. But hardware, it's a little bit more challenging. So it's been awesome having you on the show. And one of the things, definitely recommend, for the audience, definitely do read the Practical IoT Hacking. It's a fantastic book. It's definitely something that you will learn a lot. For me, I learned loads of new things and new skills. For the audience, and it's really in the hacking side of things, you really want to expand into IoT side of things. Beau, Paulino, anything you'd like to leave the audience into something that they should do next, beyond reading the book?
Yeah, I just really encourage everybody to get involved with something that they really care about, and to take on IoT. It's challenging, but it's a
Mhm.
lot of fun, and you can make a real difference.
I
Absolutely.
also feel like this field is very new, so a bunch of new technologies that are kind of like being brought into a bunch of products.
Mhm.
So there's a huge opportunity for you to write new tools, software and hardware as well. So yeah, I encourage you to play around with that. You'll definitely have fun.
Absolutely. I think for many in the industry, that this is a really great area to expand your skills into. And it's definitely in the future, there's going to be a lot of jobs and a lot of exciting opportunities for people, to work in this field. So, Beau, Paulino, it's been fantastic having you on the show. Really, hopefully look forward to catching up with you at some point in an event. So I'll
Yeah.
definitely, whether being at, DEF CON in the near future, or another event, really look forward to catching up. Again, many thanks for the audience. Again, subscribe. Every 2 weeks we have the episodes. Make sure you stay up to date. Go and look at some of the older episodes. And it's been fantastic, Beau, Paulino. Thank you for being on the show. You've been awesome guests.
Thank you. Bye bye.
Thanks.